Hello, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Maha Nassar, a 2022 non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. Today is May 14th, 2023, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Basil Farraj. Basil is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. He received his doctorate in anthropology and sociology from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. His groundbreaking research centers on the impact of Israeli torture and violence on Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian resistance to Israel's carceral regime. Regular listeners of this podcast may remember that I interviewed Basil last September. We talked about Israel's carceral regime and how it uses administrative detention as part of its colonial apparatus. And we'll have a link to that podcast in the show notes. Once again this week, Israel attacked the Palestinians of Gaza, killing 33 people, including at least 13 women and children, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Palestinian resistance factions responded by sending rockets into Israel, which resulted in 2 Israeli deaths and sent over 1.5 million Israelis into shelters. Notably, one of the conditions that Palestinian militant groups issued for agreeing to a ceasefire is that the body of Palestinian political prisoner Khader Adnan be returned to his family. Adnan died on May 2nd while in Israeli custody after a nearly 3-month-long hunger strike. Israel is currently holding the bodies of an estimated 370 Palestinians and refusing to turn them over to their families in violation of international law. And as a side note, my colleague Laura Friedman did an interview with Budur Hassan on the topic of Israel's withholding of prisoners' bodies, which we'll also have a link to in the show notes. So this connection between Khader Adnan's imprisonment and his hunger strike and death and last week's escalations are all the latest reminder of the ongoing centrality of the prisoner issue to the Palestinian struggle for freedom. Therefore, I wanted to have Basil back on the program so we could discuss how Palestinians, both individually and collectively, resist Israel's ongoing carceral regime. So Basil, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thanks to you, Maha. Glad to be back on this show with you.
Thank you. So on May 2nd, we learned that Palestinian political prisoner Khader Adnan had died in Israeli custody. Israel had arrested him for the 12th time, and this was Adnan's 5th hunger strike. His previous hunger strikes were in response to his administrative detention, that is, indefinite incarceration without charge or trial. His latest hunger strike, however, came after he was indicted for membership in an illegal organization, Islamic Jihad, and for multiple counts of incitement. So hunger striking is an extremely difficult and frankly, at least to me, unfathomable choice to have to make. So my question to you first is, under what circumstances might a Palestinian political prisoner feel the need to turn to hunger striking?
So thanks, Maha, again for the invitation. And truly, it's I guess just to start, by saying that it's definitely a difficult time for Palestinians as we commemorate the anniversary of the Nakba, but also, and I'm sure we will get into this later on, but the commemorating. The act of commemoration itself is also, unfortunately, an ongoing event in a way, since these atrocities and the original Nakba event has not stopped, and as you have alluded, with the recent war and killing in Gaza, the death of hunger striking prisoner Khader Adnan, and other events that we have been witnessing across historic Palestine. So to start, maybe just to kind of allude to the broader theme of hunger strikes, and to say that this practice itself, the practice of hunger striking, is not novel to the Palestinian prisoners movement, nor is it novel to other struggles around the world, both historically and contemporary. But maybe when we talk about Palestine in specific and think about why prisoners choose this very difficult and painful strategy to counter Israeli carceral practices, I would say two things. First of all, it might be seen as a last resort where Palestinian prisoners can actually counter or force, or at least try to force, the Israeli prison authorities and the broader Israeli government to give them their rights, or to backtrack on certain issues, and we will get into that by giving some specificities. But also, and this is kind of to complicate the act of hunger striking itself, I have been looking into a couple of cases where Palestinian detainees or prisoners actually went on hunger strikes inside interrogation chambers or inside solitary confinement. So in a way that actually complicates the notion that hunger strikes necessarily need a strong support on the outside of prisons. So in a way that also makes us wonder, why do people secluded locations such as interrogation rooms, interrogation chambers, decide to go on hunger strikes, knowing that people would not hear about their cause? So in a way, I think that also points to the power itself of hunger striking, as, first of all, of course, as a last resort, where the prisoner, I would imagine the prisoners would have tried other tactics and strategies to counter certain policies, but also I guess the difficulty in undertaking such a this decision, and that's why I'm mentioning the few cases I know, at least that I have been working with through my my work on carceral practices, where detainees would again undergo hunger strikes, in solitary confinement or in interrogation chambers, knowing that or possibly knowing that no one would hear about their cause, in a way. So I think it's resorting to your body, not as a last resort, knowing that you are approaching death, but maybe trying to forcibly assert perhaps the political nature of your imprisonment or the justness of your cause. And I think that was symbolized perhaps painfully with the death of Khader Adnan, who ultimately it was not his, as you have mentioned, it was not his first hunger strike, but he approached his death through hunger strike, and through forcibly or trying to force the Israeli authorities to give him his rights, knowing that he was facing a fascist government. So and also maybe just to go back to your question again, Maha, it's to kind of reiterate that it's a difficult decision that Palestinian detainees, or I would imagine other people, would undertake. It can be viewed as a last resort where they had tried previous attempts. For example, if we're talking specifically about hunger striking against administrative detention, for instance, I mean, Palestinian prisoners have been trying, they have tried to boycott military courts, for example, over the past few years. Still, Israel does continue to resort to this policy of arbitrarily detaining Palestinians. So we can understand it in a sense as a last resort, but also to complicate it a little bit by saying that I think it's a desire for life. It's a desire for justice also, where those detainees facing this fascist government are left with no choice but to use their body as a weapon, as a tool to counter Israeli carceral policies and the unjust reality that they are living under.
Thank you for that. I think you're so what you're alluding to here, and I think it ties a bit into what we talked about last time. Part of Israel's carceral regime is to try to assert full control over all aspects of Palestinians' lives and bodies. And so what I'm hearing you saying is that hunger striking, even if it's done in isolation, even if others don't hear about it, it's a way for the prisoner himself or herself to tell themselves and to tell the incarcerators, you don't have full control over my body and over myself. And the other point I think that's really important, and I think we're going to circle back to this, is that it is a demand of life and not a call for death. I think that's something that also often gets missed. So thank you for that too. So this issue of prisoners is one that's probably one of the most important for Palestinians because it touches the lives of almost every Palestinian living under Israeli rule. An estimated 40% of all Palestinian men living under Israeli occupation have been incarcerated at some point in their lives. And so those incarcerations have a huge impact not only on them, but on their family members and on Palestinian society as a whole. So there really is no Palestinian under occupation who isn't touched by the prisoner issue in some way or another. So can you talk to us about how Palestinians are impacted by Israel's system of mass incarceration?
Yeah, so I mean, you're completely right, Mahan, in alluding to this, to the massive nature through which Israeli carceral policies are implemented. Now, if we think about the way in which Israeli carceral policies affect Palestinians, we could start perhaps with the family level, the small immediate family level. And on this point, I would say, it has the impact of tearing apart Palestinian families. And this is not, we could, of course, list the statistics of as you have mentioned, but also there's another aspect of Israeli deliberate Israeli carceral policies where they would place Palestinian families and the prisoners and the detainee in a constant state of waiting. So, for example, if you're an administrative detainee, you are constantly, not yourself, of course, as a detainee only, but you and your family are constantly waiting for this, for the end of the current detention order, not knowing if you will be released or not, awaiting for the next order if it comes, when will it come, when will you be released? And the same process of waiting, perhaps best epitomized by the administrative detention orders and reality, but it's also a reality that faces Palestinians in general in military courts, where the families, of course, and the process itself of reaching military courts for families is insane, since you have to go through certain inspections. You have to attend. I mean, if you want to see your loved ones in military courts, if we're starting at that level of the detention process, then you have to, it's a continuous process of attending multiple military courts, constantly waiting, paying in some cases exorbitant amounts of fees for lawyers, not knowing how the military orders or the military law would treat your detained family member, not having an expectation actually of how long these family members would be incarcerated for eventually. So that kind of sense of constant perpetual waiting, I think, is an overarching theme that Palestinian prisoners and their families live under. I mean, I have, there are multiple stories of Palestinian kids growing up without their parents, while either a male or a female a prisoner, and that constant, and I think it's deliberate, and we can actually describe this as a form of violence that the Israeli carceral regime uses against prisoners and their families. And if we proceed from this step, we would also see the same process in family visitations, for example. Not all Palestinians, and this is for the listeners, of course, not all Palestinians have the right. I mean, technically, by law, they should have the right to visit their family members, but the Israeli law treats Palestinians or grants them rights depending on which identity cards they have. So, for example, if you are a family resident of the West Bank, you would have to apply for permits. If you are a male Palestinian relative of a Palestinian prisoner, then it's probably very difficult, or you to be provided with a permit to visit incarcerated family members. If you are provided with a permit, that might be just for a 1 or 2 time visit a year, which is regularly what's offered to young male Palestinian relatives of prisoners. So, and of course, the process itself of going to prison visitation rooms is very long. It involves long waiting times. It involves humiliation, where you are inspected multiple times at checkpoints at the Israeli prison facilities themselves. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is that we could understand the impact of this kind of carceral reality through the notion of waiting, I guess, or perpetual waiting, where not only the prisoner himself or herself, are in that state of waiting. And here, I should probably also allude to the fact that there are multiple Palestinians who are who have been sentenced or have already spent over 20 years of imprisonment in Israeli prisons, and those who are sentenced with multiple life sentences, for example. So imagine the psychological impact of being handed down, a multiple life sentence, for example. How would the prisoner and their family deal with that, knowing that you would only be released if there, realistically, if there are prison exchange, for instance, that would allow you to be free, or if there are other resistance practices that that force the Israeli authorities to release those prisoners. But that sense of waiting is, or at least the perpetual state of waiting, I think is by itself an entry point to understanding the impact of the carceral regime. And then we can extend this also through viewing the broader carceral reality that Israel has put in place. So applying for permits to visit your loved ones. The idea that, not the idea, even the reality, the way the Israeli forces raid Palestinian homes early in the morning to arrest family members, where actually in reality they could come just with, a few soldiers if they want to, to kind of have tone down their raids. So applying for permits, accessing checkpoints, the realities that Palestinians from the Gaza Strip face if and when they want to visit their relatives. And here, as a side note, of course, and I was alluding to this a bit before, but visitation rights is granted depending on the identity cards that Palestinians possess, and Gaza residents face the most kind of notorious restrictions, let's say, with regards to visitation rights. And then I would also, I don't know how much time I have, but I would also add, for example, the exuberant amount of money that Palestinians have to pay actually to contribute to Palestinian prisoners, since Israel has kind of adopted this private model of running Israeli prisons where the prisoners actually need to buy their products from the prison canteen. So on average, the Palestinian families would pay for each detainee kind of 800 to 1,600 shekels every few months. That's on average, and that's the minimum, so that they can buy their basic needs, which Israel sells at higher levels than they are in the market. So the canteen itself is also a place where it exerts kind of this financial burden on Palestinians. So we could also talk about the financial aspect of captivity, the absence of the father or the mother figure, and how that impacts the economy and the economic situation of the families, but also how much families have to pay actually for lawyers, for military fines when people are persecuted and detained and sentenced in military courts, or what they have to contribute actually for tobacco or for the canteen, which in some cases, Maha, can actually reach almost $1,000 a month. And you can imagine how that kind of economic reality affects families. So we're talking about two levels in a way, that kind of economic aspect of this new, I've been trying to work through this, but this kind of novel private model that Israel has been implemented through its canteen system, but also what families financially have to pay to deal with this military courts and the military prison and the prisons themselves. So this
is something I think most listeners don't really understand. So you're talking about a private prison system, and in the U.S. we're familiar with the idea of a privatized prison system, but what you're describing is a bit different in that the basic necessities that, according to international law, prisoners are supposed to be given and be sort of have a right to under imprisonment they're not being provided to them by the Israeli incarcerators, and so families have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to make sure that their loved ones have basic needs. At the same time, the main breadwinners are now behind bars and so can't contribute to the family finances. So there's a double financial burden on top of the psychological and emotional burden of waiting and not knowing when your loved ones are going to be released. And so this, I think, transitions us well to the next question I have, which is that and something that you talked about when you described hunger strikers. So Palestinians consider these prisoners, so Palestinians who are incarcerated and Palestinian society as a whole consider them to be political prisoners who are fighting for freedom. And as such, the conditions of their detention should be in line with the Geneva Convention relevant to the treatment of prisoners of war. And that convention, as we just said, requires the prison authorities to provide basic needs for those who are imprisoned. But Israel doesn't recognize these prisoners as political prisoners. They call them security prisoners. And as we discussed last time, they subject Palestinians to various forms of torture and inhumane treatment. Now, earlier this year, Israeli Police Minister Ben-Gvir claimed, somewhat preposterously, that Palestinian political prisoners have it too good and called for even more inhumane treatment of them. So can you please share with us about some of the punitive measures that the Israeli Prison Authority introduced earlier this year, additionally punitive measures, and how Palestinian prisoners responded to them?
Yeah, but if I just can circle back just to one point regarding privatization, just to say that so that it's understood correctly, it's not the Israeli, it's not a private model, but it's a very novel way of extracting financial or actually placing the burden of imprisonment on Palestinian families. So in a way, kind of, it has, if we trace the historical changes in prisons from the 70s and 80s until now, there's been a reduction in the provisions provided by the Israel Prison Service, and at the same time, kind of placing that burden of providing for prisoners and their daily lives on the families of the prisoners and the prisoners themselves and the broader, Palestinian Authority structure. To answer your question, so it's important also to note here that Ben-Gvir has been saying this, that prisoners have been having it too good, but also to provide kind of a context to this, that one of the previous ministers of public security, Khader Adnan, who is currently the Israeli permanent representative at the United Nations, when he was heading the Ministry of Public Security, he also kind of referred to the reality and the conditions of Palestinian prisoners in a similar vein. He formed a committee called the Erdan Committee in 2018 that similarly tried to deal with this kind of issues and saying that prisoners are consuming too much water, that the Israeli authorities need to set the Palestinian prisoners' conditions to the minimum required by international law. So just to say that Ben-Gvir has been saying this, but this is a policy that's long been practiced and viewed by the Israeli authority. So yes, similarly, Ben-Gvir has been trying to kind of attack. I mean, he has been running on this agenda of attacking prisoners' rights, and maybe some of your listeners would know that he has been trying and talking about instating a death penalty for prisoners or for those who commit certain acts, as he refers to it. He refers to them as terrorists, basically. So these kind of inflammatory comments he's been using, I mean, some of them he's been trying to ban hot bread. I mean, as absurd as banning hot bread in the morning for Palestinian prisoners, but also controlling the amount of hot water that prisoners have access to. He's been trying, I mean, he went to Nafha, one of the most secure prisons, Nafha prison, and he said, that prisoners need to only shower for 4 minutes a day, and that they would try to kind of put a rule of having water for the showers for only 1 hour throughout the day. He's also been trying to, I mean, as I said, yes, kind of instating or passing a law that allows for death penalty or legalizes the death penalty. But here I want to kind of concretely provide what some prisoners, according to Ad-Damir's recent report that was published in January, it cited the impact of Israel's new ultra-nationalist government on the Palestinian prisoners movement. This was really, you could find it on Ad-Damir's website. So through their testimonies with prisoners, particularly from Megiddo prison, the report says that these prisoners were informed about kind of new changes that would take place. They were not implemented, and I will tell you why. But just to understand what Ben-Gvir was trying to do, these changes included, for example, changing the types of goods that prisoners can buy from the canteen, so the prisoners kind of market, limiting family visitations from 45 minutes to half an hour per month, limiting the amount of time that they could actually go out to their yard, which is the free time. Abolishing the prisoners' representative committee, which is also an attempt by the Khader Adnan's committee as well in 2019, and constantly moving prisoners from wards and from prisons, between prisons, different prisons. They also report Adamir reports that the kind of the idea of hanging Israeli flags in prison rooms, confiscating prisoners' properties, and changing and forcibly, as I said, forcibly transferring prisoners every 3 months from their cells and from different prisons. Now, as you can tell, these attempts were kind of trying to take away what prisoners have actually gained through multiple struggles over the years. You know, if we trace the trajectory of the prisoners' movement, we would understand that the rights they currently have were not granted by the Israeli authorities because Israel granted them. No, actually, they were kind of forced upon the Israeli authorities through multiple years and multiple attempts at struggle inside Israeli prisons. So what happened is, after Ben Gvir's kind of inflammatory remarks and his attempt to kind of change the dynamics actually of how prisons are run. And again, the way they are run is due to years of struggle. The Palestinian prisoners kind of launched a statement, and they said that they would undergo a collective hunger strike in March on the first day of Ramadan of this year. And then the Israeli authorities kind of backed down on these changes. And that, I think, that kind of to tie us back to your first question, that alludes to not only the strength of a hunger strike in action, but also to the threat of a hunger strike, I think, and particularly in this case, in a collective hunger strike. Yeah, and I hope that this is kind of just the answer to this part of the question.
Thank you. So the threatened changes ranged from the cruel to the absurd. I mean, hanging flags and things like that. And we'll also
banning hot bread in the morning.
Hot bread in the morning. We'll have a link to Adamir's report in the show notes as well for listeners who want to learn more. So just to remind you, I'm Maha Nassar on the Occupied Thoughts podcast, and I'm speaking with Dr. Basil Farraj about Palestinian political prisoners and their resistance to Israel's carceral regime. So Basil, you just mentioned that this collective hunger strike was averted in March at the beginning of Ramadan with an agreement that was reached between the Israel prison authorities not to implement these additional punitive measures, and between them and the Palestinian prisoners organization. So Israel agreed to suspend these more inhumane measures, and many observers saw it as another hard-fought victory for the prisoners who had organized collectively. And many commentators noted that this collectivity was organized across political factions. So can you talk to us a little bit, please, about how such collective organizing happens in Israeli prisons, particularly in light of what we read about Israel trying to set different political factions against one another, putting certain prisoners in solitary confinement, restricting their ability to talk to one another. So in that kind of environment, how does such collective organizing happen?
So I think this comes down to, to the notion of, or to the strength of a collective mode of resistance, first of all, and secondly, to the centrality of the Palestinian prisoners movement. So in a way, I think, and particularly because this new government was trying to kind of take away what prisoners have gained through their years of struggle, that the Palestinian prisoners felt that this needed and deserved kind of collective response. Now, the way these kind of collective responses take place and shape, I think, is perhaps very structured, actually, because as I had maybe alluded, that each political party, each cell, each ward has their own representative from political factions who meet, constantly meet, and kind of deliberate on which steps to take. But and I think, and this is the regular process. For example, when the Palestinian administrative detainees decided to kind of undergo a collective military boycott, collective boycott of military courts, this was done, in a collective fashion in agreement with all the political parties represented in Israeli captivity, for instance. So these kind of collective steps require that sense of unified front. Otherwise, the Israeli authorities would attack a particular political party or ward or prison and leave the other ones behind, in a sense. And that kind of their policy of attacking certain political parties or certain people, and we have witnessed this, for example, in the way they have been functioning over the past few months with their violent campaigns across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But what I'm saying is that the structures are there, so the political parties are organized inside prisons, and maybe that's one thing that the Israeli authorities have not been able to kind of entirely eradicate, that there's a high level of structure of political authority that Palestinians have managed to kind of hold tight to across their political factions, that these political factions have their own divisions, their own bureaucracy, and they tend to kind of meet and decide on certain things. And I think, but for me at least, what has happened in March shows that the Israeli attempts to divide, and this has long been tried, to divide the Palestinian prisoners community, to fragment it, to grant certain privileges, has not been entirely accomplished, and that prisoners are aware that that in their unity, or that their unity brings certain successes and results that that they would not be able to achieve if they had worked separately. And again, that's why the prisoners movement is very central to the Palestinian struggle, and that's why it has not maybe been entirely affected by the divisions that have taken place outside Israeli prisons, which we are living in today's Palestine. So the political divisions, the societal divisions, the geographic divisions, but the Palestinian prisoners movement has managed, I think, to an extent, to kind of hold tight to this collective organizing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that they've been able to transcend the political factions that plague other dimensions of Palestinian society. And one would think too that the Palestinian prisoners, because of the regard with which Palestinian society holds them as a whole, because of their sacrifices and the sacrifices of their families, that their ability to transcend those political divisions gives them even more standing, I would think, in Palestinian society. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and yes, I think so. And also, for example, tomorrow, I was reading that the Palestinian prisoners are planning a collective hunger strike for one day, because maybe also your listeners have heard about this, but one of the prisoners, Walid Dakka, who has been incarcerated, imprisoned for over 30 years now, he has been diagnosed with a very serious disease, and I mean, he has less than 2 years left to be released, and the Israeli authorities have been denying him kind of early release. And so they're undergoing a hunger strike to demand his release, to show solidarity with also a few Palestinian leaders who were sent recently to solitary confinement, including the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Ahmad Saadat, who were sent to, he's an old political figure who's been sent to solitary confinement very recently, and also to show solidarity with, or to demand the release of Khader Adnan's body. So in a way, I think since we're talking about this tomorrow itself, even though it's a one-day hunger strike, but it's again, it shows us that, first of all, the centrality of hunger strikes as a tactic, when prisoners do not, I mean, when they cannot manage, or when they want to force the authorities to do certain things, but also to the strength of the movement when it's acting in a unified fashion. And particularly, again, because I think, Maha, you're very right on pointing attention to Ben Gvir and to their government policies, because they are, what they are doing now is trying to eradicate not only the Palestinian, as a living subject, but also politically, and what the cause means, and what the Palestinian movement means also. What does it imply how it functions. And I think this kind of constant unified acts are a reassertion of the political nature of imprisonment and the justness of our cause in general.
So that also, I think, leads us nicely to my next question. So last year you wrote an essay titled Define Carcerality, Prisoner Writings Behind Bars, which we'll also have a link to in the show notes. And so the heightened political awareness and heightened political and intellectual output, I think, is also an important dimension of the prisoner movement that often gets overlooked. So can you please share with us what role does writing, reading, and studying play for Palestinian prisoners? And how does access to books and notebooks become sites of contention with the Israeli prison authority?
Yeah, so actually, since we're talking about hunger strikes, the right to access, to have books in prisons, to have pens and papers was actually given to prisoners through hunger strikes, through previous hunger strikes, and during the early years of the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So that actually kind of nicely fits back to our central theme of today's discussion. But how does the act of writing itself kind of constitute a political action? I would say that first of all, on one front, it's a metaphorical escape from the prison, I think, in many ways. So if we want to understand how prisoners actually, and there are multiple, we refer to this in Palestine as, and other parts of the Arab world as prison literature, adab al-sijun. But the way actually these publications see the light is by itself an attempt of smuggling that takes place, either smuggling or trying to kind of, imagine big books, right? How do the prisoners manage to send out these written materials or these spoken materials that later get printed and distributed? So by itself there's this kind of smuggling aspect that already counters Israel's kind of secure and fortified walls of captivity. Multiple prisoners have shared with me as I was doing my research how this process takes place, the way they have to actually hide the smuggled written notes, how they actually eventually manage to see the light. And I'm using the word smuggling because there's also a very important way, it's an important metaphor also, but a lived reality in the ways that helps us understand how prisoners interact with the outside world. So how they manage to communicate, how they manage to even smuggle sperm, as must maybe some of the listeners know, and how they manage to even smuggle their own sense of political organization, which I think is also an act that's intimately linked to writing. So the way they organize their political structures, the way they organize their educational circles, these are important aspects of captivity inside Israeli prisons that I think are intimately linked to the act of writing, to the act of publishing, to the act of reading. And I think there's constantly this essential step of bypassing Israeli surveillance, either inside prisons or outside prisons. And I think it's kind of the act of writing or smuggling the sense of writing, or what prisoners write, alludes to the power of writing as a metaphor of escaping the prison. And I think if we understand that Israel has, and still actually continues to this day, to restrict prisoners' access to certain books. I mean, I would give the listeners here one example where we were trying to have prisoners, access certain books, and then we realized that actually these books are subject to the surveilling gaze of the Israeli prison authority. So the prison authority decides, the prison service decides which books are worthy of being sent to prison or not. So for example, if they see a book that's, very visibly, let's say Palestinian, or talking about Palestinian resistance and struggle, then they might decide arbitrarily not to have prisoners access it, for example. Some prisoners, or some books actually remain for months inside the waiting rooms as Israeli prison service inspects them and reads them, which I doubt if they do actually, but, just the idea of kind of placing their power over what enters and what leaves prison, I think. And that's why I started my answer with the idea of smuggling, because prisons have managed to, even the books that are denied or that are not allowed, they actually managed to bring it through. And vice versa, trying to smuggle their writings outside prisons, and in particular, Palestinian prison literature is very vast. I mean, it's a vast, disciplinary and literary production that deals with topics about torture, violence, freedom, imagining liberation, for example. And on this note, I would also say, Maha, that there's a sense of some of the books that are written by prisoners, either by prisoners who are currently held or former prisoners, are also an attempt to teach Palestinians how to resist. So there's also a big, or a number of books that have dealt with the experience of interrogation and torture, for example, where they share their experiences, where prisoners share their experiences of interrogation, expose certain tactics to the Palestinian detainee to be, the ones who will be detained in the future, for example, and teaching them how they can resist and be resilient and not confess, for example. So in a way, it's a process, it's a continuous process of sharing knowledge that trespasses Israel's surveillance. And I think that's where the power of writing comes. And also, it's a way for us to understand why Israel restricts access to certain books, and also has been fighting prisoners' access to formal education as well.
Great, thank you for that. So writing and studying and reading both as a form of resilience, but also as a form of resistance. So it's both resilience within, during their time behind bars, but also resistance to this idea of isolating and removing them. And it has that political function as well, right? Political education, political movement building, and so forth, as opposed to just, well, those are prisoners, we want to isolate them.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So to wrap up, we are recording this podcast on May 14th as Nakba commemorations are taking place around the world, and as even more commemorations will take place tomorrow, May 15th, the anniversary of the Nakba. One of the major themes of all these events is the Nakba is ongoing. So how do you see the prisoner issue fitting in with the concept of the ongoing Nakba and the long Palestinian struggle for freedom?
Yes. Perhaps I would say through since carcerality is an ongoing theme that Palestinians continue to live and grapple with, not only inside prisons but in the way in which Israel has been exerting its power over Palestinian populations, either across historic Palestine or even in diaspora. So, for example, we could think about denying the right of return of Palestinians. And this is all carceral function, right? I mean, if people come to an airport or to the border crossing and then they would send them back, I mean, that's an act of, it's detention, it's an imprisonment. So we could actually expand the way we view imprisonment to kind of understand the logics that the logics through which Israeli power functions, where it's kind of organized around this notion of carcerality, of granting access to certain people and denying it to others. But also, if we focus on the prison itself, perhaps it's important to remember that there are 23 prisoners who have been held since before the signing of the Oslo Accords. So we're talking about that they have spent over 30 years in captivity. Some of them, the majority of them. Walid Dakka was arrested, for example, in March 1986. There are multiple prisoners who have been sentenced for multiple life sentences, for example. So that ongoing nature of the Nakba, ongoing captivity, is central, I think, to the way Israel continues its carceral practices. Every day there are daily arrests, daily invasions of towns, the killing of people, and that that imprisonment is, and maybe just to kind of wrap up with 2 points, that imprisonment has constantly been central to the way Israel has been dealing with the Palestinian population. And I think that's where we can think about the ongoing nature of dispossession, of violence, of exile, of the way it actually links to, I mean, some people were exiled from prison directly outside. For example, Salah al-Hamouri recently. He was sent outside immediately from prison, taken to the airport and sent to France. So that's an act of forced exile, right? That links itself to the physical space of the prison. And then, of course, we can expand this more and more. But also to say that we started today talking about Khader Adnan, and also there have been other people who were killed inside prison, people who were force-fed during the early years of Israel's 1967 occupation. And then they died due to that force feeding act. And then the bodies that Israel continues to hold inside its cemeteries of numbers or freezers. And I think that these all are characteristic of Israel, of the way Israel treats the Palestinian body and spirit, but also it alludes to this kind of ongoing nature of again, dispossession, exile, violence that's intimately linked to Israel carceral structures, whether the physical prison itself or how it has been organizing its governance of the Palestinian population.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to wrap up. And so thank you so much to Basil Farraj for sharing your time and analysis with us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can also watch video versions of our podcasts, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Maha Nassar, signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.